Okay. My name is Carol Weinshell. I'm the Vice President of Program and Membership at Congregation Rodeph Sholom in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Today is February 8th, and we have a wonderful program with our own Rabbi Richard Eisenberg and Paul Friend, who is coming directly from New Jersey. Now, my job is to keep this rolling, literally, and I'm going to ask you all to mute yourselves. If you are not muted, the teacher and me will mute you. And if you have a question, there will be plenty of time for question and discussion. I'll ask you to raise your hand either by using the Zoom hand raise or raising your hand. If I miss you, our president, Debbie Bowles, whose job it is to make sure I don't miss anybody, will let me know. So we kind of tag team this. This is the second year that Rabbi Eisenberg and Paul Friend have participated, have run a program. And I can tell you, based on the last series they did, you're in for a treat. It's going to be a fabulous, fabulous evening. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and you'll see how the two of them just mesh beautifully. So Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Carol, and good evening from Central New Jersey, or as we say, Exit 118. I'm Paul Friend. I grew up in Fairfield and attended and graduated from the Rodeph Sholom Talmud Torah and continue to be a remote member. I think that's the right term. So, Jews rock and roll. We'll start this evening with mainly the 50s and 60s. And it's a fact that during the first part of the 50s, the music of the 40s was still glowing very strong. Rock and roll did not make its rude entrance, and it was rude until the mid-50s. And to illustrate this point, let's talk about my parents, without whom I would not be here tonight. My dad, Bob Friend, and my mom, Barbara Fiedelholtz at the time, met at the Ritz Ballroom in Bridgeport, I think off of Fairfield Avenue, on Saturday, October 8th, 1954, at a post-Yom Kippur Break the Fast big band dance. My mom tells me that she was attracted to my dad, to Bob Friend, because A, he wasn't bad looking, B, more importantly, he really knew how to dance. And my mom loved to dance, and so did my dad. And they both loved music. My dad played the accordion, and my mom's dad, Paul Fiedelholtz, which means fiddle maker, came from a family of about 9 musician sons. Imagine having 9 musician kids. Now, consider the following. A dance scheduled at the Ritz, which, by the way, no longer is there on Fairfield Avenue, but it was close to the Fairfield-Bridgeport town line. A dance scheduled at the Ritz on May 22nd, 1955, 7 months later from the day or night my parents met, featuring Fats Domino, who the rabbi, I think, or Carol already mentioned, was canceled by the Bridgeport police, citing worries about rock and roll music and a recent near riot at the New Haven Arena, not the New Haven Coliseum. Before the New Haven Coliseum was the New Haven Arena. By the way, that was not the most famous riot at the New Haven Arena. That happened 12 years later when Jim Morrison of the Doors was arrested at the New Haven Arena in December of 1967 after getting into an argument with the New Haven police. And by the way, the guitarist for the Doors was Rabbi Krieger, a Jew. But I digress. My point is that my parents just missed out on the beginnings of rock in Bridgeport and in the country. And given the timing, it's no surprise to me that they never really liked rock music. they liked the big band stuff that was dominant just before the rise of early rock and roll. And I'm now going to turn it back over to Rabbi, but I will tell you, or I will talk to you about early rock, meaning the 1950s, when I next come back to you. But I wanted to set the scene that if you want to talk about the beginnings of rock right after my parents met is probably a good time to start that talk. So we'll start with about 1955 or so. And in my next portion, I'll talk to you about the Jewish influence on rock of the 50s. There's so much there that we could just spend hours just on the 50s, but I'll try to keep my comments short like myself. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks so much for co-leading these sessions with us, and for Rodeph Sholom, your congregation of origin. Paul, as I mentioned earlier, is going to do the fun stuff, and he's going to focus tonight on the 50s. I'm actually going to go back hundreds of years. Well, no, first I'm going to go back maybe about 80 to some odd years before the 1950s, because I want to give you a little background. And that's why my stuff is a little bit dry, but you'll bear with me. And I think some of you are going to, if not all of you, are going to know at least some of what I'm going to say. But I think it's still important to put the Jewish involvement and influence on rock and roll in a context, in its historical framework. So all you have to do is go back to immigration, mass immigration from Eastern Europe in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And lest you think I'm being too much of a modernist, I can assure you that a little later on tonight, when after we go to Paul and you come back to me later on, I'm going to actually go back several centuries even before that, historically, to try to understand the framework of what we're dealing with here. But just think about the droves of Jews who came from Eastern Europe to our shores. And think for a moment about the phenomenal drive that they possessed to assimilate, to merge, to mold into the melting pot that was late 18th century America. And think about how, in so many ways, Jews were marginalized. I'll come back to this, but they were marginalized, especially the Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews. They were kind of like on the edge of mainstream American culture. But with that, they had this kind of chameleon-like ability to take on and absorb the hallmarks and features of American culture at the time. And so much so that many Jews who came from Eastern Europe were not only able to absorb and pick up popular culture of America, but they actually were able to get ahead of it and become trend and pace setters. So let's ask you, and you can just call it out, just unmute and call it out. Give me an example of one or two Jews of Eastern European origin who became trendsetters in popular music of the time. I'm talking about turn of the century, 1900, and the first part of the 20th century. Throw out a few names for me in the field of music first. Go ahead, anybody.
Al Jolson.
Al Jolson. Who said that?
Irving Berlin.
Well, who said Al Jolson?
Joan did.
Okay, so you know Al Jolson, whose Yiddish original name was Asa Jolson, whose father was a chazan in Washington, D.C., Al Jolson is an excellent example because he actually was able to mold. He was very much influenced by, we think about the jazz singer that was, widely misnamed the first talking picture. It actually wasn't technically the first talking picture. There was one or two before it, but Al Jolson was very much influenced by jazz, by the popular culture that was connected with Black music, especially in New Orleans. So Jolson's a great example. Did somebody else say Irving Berlin? Irving Berlin, born Israel Balin from a Russian Jewish family. Not only was he able to, in a chameleon-like fashion, pick up trends of American culture, but he wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band, which is one of his first big hits. And Alexander's Ragtime Band, which I don't have this completely at the front of my head, but I think it came out in the 19 teens, like 1912 or 1913. It was very early. And Berlin was a young man coming from Tin Pan Alley, in New York. And he wrote this song that became wildly popular. And if you just took the average American on the street in St. Louis, in the Midwest, or wherever, when that song came out, and you told that person, oh, by the way, the author of that song was Israel Balin from Russia, a Jew, Yiddish-speaking Jew from Russia, they would have thought you were out of your mind. Okay, so that's a few examples in the world of music. We can come up with many others. Richard Rodgers, Gershwin, the Gershwin brothers, and so on and so forth, right? And then the popular songwriters, Harold Arlen and Harburg, and some of them were songwriters, some of them were lyricists. There were just so many. I mean, too many to name, right? Rodgers, Jerome Kern, Lawrence Hart. You could go on and on and on, right? There's so many. Now, what about movies? So, again, amazingly, these Jews who either were born in Eastern Europe or were in the very first generation of new Americans, were sitting in Hollywood with their Yiddish accents, employing people like Claudette Colbert and Clark Gable, and giving orders to Gloria Swanson, and we could go on and on and on, right? Name me some of the movie moguls who were Jewish. Anyone?
Louis B. Mayer.
Louis B. Mayer, later of MGM, right? Yeah. Who else?
Samuel Goldwyn.
Samuel Goldwyn, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, whose I think his original name was Goldfish. Yeah, but Goldfish doesn't sound so great in Hollywood, so he changed it to Goldwyn. Why not? Okay, who else?
Zanuck.
I'm not sure if Zanuck was Jewish. I have to look that up.
Oh, okay.
Not sure about Zanuck, but Irving Thalberg, Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures, Carl Laemmle of Universal. I mean, who was it that made Dracula and Frankenstein so famous in the 1930s? It was a Jew, Carl Laemmle, who was the head of Universal Studios. So movies, we were the pace setters, we were the trendsetters. And again, we could go on and on. Broadway theater, Showboat, right? Oscar Hammerstein and Jerome Kern, Pal Joey, Rodgers and Hart, Later on, the Rodgers and Hammerstein great classic shows.
Oklahoma.
You're right, like Oklahoma. Irving Berlin shows like Annie Get Your Gun and, Kiss Me Kate and all those other, and then going later on into the 20th century, people like Frank Lesser and Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim and Jules Stein.
How about Florence Ziegfeld? Was he Jewish?
Florence Ziegfeld was Jewish, I believe.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, exactly. They were, but here's the point. I mean, we could spend an hour just on this, but the point I want to make here, it's a really interesting trend to me, is that you had Jews who were just by definition in America outsiders. Were Jews going to be admitted into the posh clubs and country clubs and exclusive dining establishments of Boston and New York City? The answer is no. Irving Berlin converted when he married his Catholic wife, right? And maybe he gained admission to some of those establishments, but still, he was an extreme example. But Jews did not have access, right, to these kinds of establishments. I mean, even we remember, those of us who grew up in Fairfield and Bridgeport, we couldn't go to the nobody went to the Brooklawn Country Club in those days from our people, right? Not allowed, verboten. Jews were forbidden. Forget about it.
Except the sleigh ride. That's a different story.
Yeah. And we used to traipse along their golf course, and hopefully they wouldn't kick us out that way. But
Marcia, the stories are true. I've told you about the Brooklawn Country Club. Anyway, go ahead.
Brooklawn Country Club for sure.
No.
So we did not have admission. We were on the margin. We were the outsider. And here is the paradox, right? We were the consummate insider when it comes to trendsetters and getting right into the kind of the inner fiber and workings of what makes American culture tick. We got ahead of it. We were the trendsetters, but by the same token, we remained the outsiders, ever on the margin until, relatively recently. And that is going to actually play into how we also became trendsetters in the field of rock and roll as well. If we couldn't get into the Brooklawn Country Club, we could start Atlantic Records or Chess Records. Or we could grab a guitar, right? Or we could become a singer like Neil Sedaka or Neil Diamond or Leslie Gore or some of the others that Paul's going to talk to us about. So I just want you to keep that in mind as one of the kind of intellectual background and context of Jews and rock and roll. And now I'm throwing the metronome back to Paul right now.
Thank you. And let's not even talk about the Fairfield Beach Club. I know my friend Carla, who is on the in this presentation, is familiar with the Fairfield Beach Club. And so Marcia, my wife, who's on this show, I've bored her for years and years and years about stories about Fairfields, and now she realizes they're all true, and they're not just shaggy dog stories. So it's the 1950s, and I have a trivia question for anyone or everyone. Why is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Ohio? Why is it in Cleveland? Why is it not in New York or Los Angeles or Liverpool? Anyone know?
Alan Freed.
Alan Freed. rock and roll might have existed without Alan Freed, but rock and roll would have never been born. Here's the story of Alan Freed. He was a horn player, and he actually was in a high school jazz band called the Sultans of Swing. Now, that may be a familiar song to folks who listen to rock radio in the 70s and 80s. And by the way, Mark Knopfler, the guy who wrote that song of Dire Straits, is, of course,
Jewish.
yes. And so that's where the name came from. Well, besides being a horn player and musician, he developed a passion for radio in college, and Alan Freed soon became a DJ, establishing himself in Cleveland. And his radio show consisted mainly of rhythm and blues, and he helped popularize rhythm and blues, but he decided to call it something a little more interesting, a little more sexy. He called it rock and roll. And that name helped the music catch on nationwide. And Alan's career took off. He eventually moved on to New York, where he produced live shows, now rock and roll shows, for stations such as WINS. That is the all news, give us 22 minutes and we'll give you the world station today. And these programs attracted, and I use this word intentionally, mobs of teenagers. By the mid-1950s, Alan Freed was a household name, appearing in films, popular with his radio and TV shows. His story has an unfortunate ending. In 1959, he was charged with commercial bribery, becoming a scapegoat for DJs nationwide who had accepted pay from record companies in exchange for airplay. Well, unfortunately, his career and finances was ruined, for lack of a better word, as a result of this scandal. However, he refused to admit any wrongdoing. He died still protesting his innocence in 1965, right at the rise of the British invasion, or the full tide of the British invasion is more like it. The Wall Street Journal in 2015 recalled his sizable contribution to rock and roll and to teenagers' more tolerant view of integration in the 50s. They said he gave a lot of help to hundreds of black and white artists, and his efforts in introducing rock and roll to the masses helped create thousands of jobs for musicians, engineers, producers, promoters, and even instrument manufacturers. I'm sure Leo Fender was extremely pleased, even though I have no evidence of this, with Alan Freed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is where it is, in Ohio, not in New York, not in Los Angeles, not in London, not in Liverpool. But today, a lot of people don't understand that. Even myself, at first, when the hall was open in the 80s, was a little bit confused, and I had to be reminded, if rock had a start, think about Mr. Alan Freed.
Well, Paul, by the way, just to cut in for a second, you mentioned WINS. I don't know if people can see this picture.
Yeah. Oh, I think I know who those lads are.
Okay. Yeah. And who is the fifth Beatle?
Murray the K.
Murray the K of WINS.
Yes.
In the picture. Do you see him with the Beatles?
Yes.
And that's
yes, I do. He's in the dead middle.
Okay. Sorry, Paul. Just had to.
That's okay.
Little show and tell.
No, it's fine. Yeah, we decided not to get in too much into audio and visual enhancements. But that being said, there's a famous question among Jews, and I know Rabbi would be interested in debating it. And the question is, Elvis, does he have Jewish connections or not? I just know his full name, Elvis Aaron Presley. Interesting. But we won't get into that unless Rabbi wants to make some comments about that. One of my friends asked me if I was going to talk about that topic, and I didn't answer him. But why do I start with Elvis? Because we're not going to talk about Elvis. We're going to talk about Lieber and Stoller. A lot of people hated Elvis's Hound Dog when they first heard it in 1956. My parents probably did. And so did Lieber and Stoller. Although they had a good reason, because that skinny guy Elvis was ruining their song. It was first recorded in 1953 by a lady named Big Mama Thornton. Well, wait, they didn't like their song? Well, they didn't like the way he recorded it. Lieber and Stoller were raised Jewish, but their musical influences were mainly African American. They weren't the first white songwriters to break the bounds of segregation, but they probably did it best. And the story is that Stoller heard about the Presley version of their song after Stoller came back from a vacation in Europe, and Stoller was at first disappointed about the song. However, he was later quoted, and I'll read the quote directly so I get it straight. He said, "You know, that version of our song sounded terrible. Elvis sounded terribly nervous and it went too fast. But you know, after it sold 7 or 8 million records, it started to sound much better to my ears." Well, other Lieber and Stoller songs that Elvis covered included Jailhouse Rock and King Creole, and I know there were others. And by the way, folks, I'm going to mention tonight just a barrel of songs, a bevy of songs, a waterfall of songs that I think virtually everyone listening is going to recognize. And that's something, because I'm talking about songs from the 50s and 60s. It's arguable that Lieber and Stoller probably did their most creative work with a black vocal group, the Coasters. They created, the Coasters and Lieber and Stoller, these 3-minute rock musicals, which were irreverent, but joyful and playful, and there was nothing like it that existed before. And these songs told stories, which I think is, Rabbi will connect that to the Jewish experience. What are the songs I'm talking about that were done by the Coasters? Charlie Brown, Poison Ivy, Yakety Yak, Young Blood, and Searchin'. Again, I just rattled off a bunch of songs from a set of songwriters and a vocal group that probably most people could hear it in their head as soon as I said the song. And there's more. Lieber and Stoller later worked with the Drifters with a song On Broadway by Man and Weil and guitar by Phil Spector, both of whom I'll talk about later. Save the Last Dance for Me, and their production of Up on the Roof by Goffin and King, who I'll also talk about later. Love Potion No. 9, most famously done by the Searchers. And my final comment about Lieber and Stoller is this. The only footage of the Beatles playing at the Cavern Club, a place where the Beatles played 292 times, you can look it up. The only footage of the boys playing at the Cavern Club is of a great song called Some Other Guy. Many of you may have seen that footage. Who was it written by? Lieber and Stoller. So that should tell you. I just talked about 2 songwriters and mentioned a cascade of songs that people still remember today in 2022 that came out in the late 50s. Think about that. Here's another fun and not very well-known story. The Jewish group The Tokens. They're probably one of the most, if not the most Jewish group in rock and roll, at least early rock and roll. Every member was raised in a Jewish home. In fact, their front man, a guy named Jay Siegel, actually considered becoming a cantor. He didn't. When the Tokens first started, their main singer was somebody called Neil Sedaka. You may have heard of him, and I'll mention him later too. But he left the Tokens long before their first hit, which is a song called Tonight I Fell in Love. Tonight I Fell in Love. But their real claim to fame came a year later when they reworked a folk song by the Weavers that was called Wimaway. Now, you probably know that song by another name, and you might picture it in your mind being sung by a cartoon warthog. But in 1962, Wimaway, which you really know as The Lion Sleeps Tonight, was a massive hit that was attached to a bunch of Jewish guys from New York City. It was a very odd song, but that being said, it hit number 1 in 36 countries, including, interestingly enough, Israel. remarkably odd song for the time. Still is kind of a very odd song, even in 2022. The Tokens, a Jewish group. Again, Neil Sedaka started with them. He didn't end up there, but we'll get to him later. I'll mention one more group connected, or not so much group, but Jewish brothers connected to the 50s. That's Chess Records. Leonard and Philip Chess actually immigrated from Poland as young boys, so they were off the boat, and they ran the most influential blues label, if not record label, the 50s. They had legends like, these are names that you've heard of, even if you don't know their music: Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Little Walter, Willie Dixon. They were the main Chicago blues, if not blues label of the 50s. But they had a big hand in kickstarting rock and roll because they signed Chuck Berry in 1955. Chuck Berry's first hit on Chess was Maybelline, a song that you could probably hear in your head, and the rest is history. And if you want to know just how important the Chess brothers were and Chess Records were, just ask the Rolling Stones, who recorded some stuff there when they came to the States in the 1960s. One of their main goals, according to Mick and Keith, was to visit Chess Records because, quote, that's where the blues were born. Their language, not mine. So that concludes some of my thoughts about the 1950s. If there's time, I'll talk later about the early 1960s. So Rabbi, back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, but you said it before me, that if not for Chess Records and the Jewish owners of Chess Records, there probably never would have been the Rolling Stones, because the Rolling Stones, especially Keith Richards, were very heavily influenced by blues, by American blues.
Yes.
And several of their earliest albums consisted of only a few original songs, and the rest of them were covers of either rock and roll songs or American blues songs. So
that's right. Unlike their friendly competitors, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones could, I'm going to exaggerate, they could not write songs, but that's a whole other topic, until they were basically forced to by their manager, Andrew Oldham. But different time, different subject.
Okay. So the first example, by the way, that if somebody can give me an example of one of the earliest examples of Jews telling stories in song, because Paul mentioned, the rock and roll songs as like 3-minute stories. But we actually were one of the earliest civilizations to do that in the Western world. In the Eastern cultures, that's a whole different ballgame. They might have beaten us by 5,000 years, who knows? But in the Western world, what would be one example of one of the early examples of Jews telling stories in song? Go back to your Bible. Think of the book of Exodus. And what happened right after the Israelites came through the Sea of Reeds and the Egyptians drowned? What did Moses do? He sang a song, made up a poem. It's called the Song of the Sea, right? And we sing it every morning at Rodeph Sholom. Sai always leads it. Sai, God bless him, always leads it every morning. Ashir al Adonai ki ga'oga susirachavo ramavayam. I will sing of the Lord, for he has prevailed. Horses and the chariots of Egypt drowned in the sea. Yeah, so it's telling a story by song. And then later on, King David did something similar after his victories. And the Psalms. Many of the Psalms themselves are like little stories encapsulated in a poem and a song. eventually sung by the Levites in the temple. Okay, now I want to get back for a moment to this whole, I'm just somehow, I don't know, I'm obsessed with this theme of marginalization versus in the center. I don't know. And so I'm going to come back to it just for a moment and talk about World War II and the Shoah, right? The great, horrible tragedy and catastrophe of our people. After the Shoah and World War II were over, we had the miraculous creation of Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. And in America, we had the baby boom. And an America that had become emergent. You know, we had the Cold War, but America was like the most powerful #1 country in the world with a hopeful future. And everybody was happy, right? And hopeful, except for the blacks, or many of them, in the South especially, but some in the North as well, and Jews, as well as other minorities who continued to be marginalized, blacks suffering under Jim Crow, Jews suffering under anti-Semitism and continued restriction clauses. We were still the outsider, we Jews, but we had an advantage over our African American brothers and sisters. We were light-skinned, most of us, the overwhelming majority. So we could walk down the street and we're not necessarily automatically going to be recognized as a minority, right? As opposed to our African American brothers and sisters. But notwithstanding that fact, there was still a very strong natural affinity between blacks and Jews. And it made sense for Jews, whether it be in production or behind the scenes, or whether it actually be in front on the stage or performance, it just would make sense that our people just took in a very natural and powerful way to what the African American musical community was doing. And so it would make sense that we had an inside track into rock and roll. I want to give you one more historical perspective, and then I'm going to throw it back to Paul, and then we can open it up for other comments too. And here's where I go back several centuries. As many of you know, in the medieval world, the Jews, in the overwhelming majority of places that we lived in the diaspora, were forbidden from owning land. We could not own land, and therefore we were forced into certain kinds of work that we would not necessarily have chosen ourselves. But because we couldn't be landowners and farmers on our own land, we engaged in commerce, commercialism, business and trade, business and finance, money lending. And why was it that we had to engage in money lending or usury? Because the Catholics in medieval times believed that they were forbidden to lend money to their co-religionists on interest and collect interest. That was one instance where they decided they were going to follow the laws of the Torah verbatim and ignore a lot of the other laws of the Torah. But that particular law, they accepted that we can't collect money from our fellow Catholics. We can't lend money on interest. So who was left to do it? That's where the Jews stepped in, of course, as we know this. So as the centuries continued to progress, it became kind of programmed into our cultural DNA of the Jewish people to become very proficient and adept at commerce, finance, and business. And therefore, it's no huge surprise that these marginalized Jews who might not have been able to gain a seat on the Wall Street Exchange or in the most prominent banking houses of New York, J.P. Morgan Chase and so on and so forth. But if they couldn't do that, they created record companies like the Chess Brothers, whom Paul just referred to, or Herb Abramson, who was the founder of Atlantic Records, later Atco Records, Atlantic Records. A name that you probably never heard of, definitely Jewish, Florence Greenberg. Has anybody ever heard of Florence Greenberg? She owned Scepter Records, and Scepter Records produced the Shirelles, a very popular and prominent African-American female group, right? So those are some of the record owners. And then we have the record, and Geffen, David Geffen, we could go on and on and on. And then we have the record producers, my God, Phil Spector, whose life was filled with scandal and wound up dying in jail, having been convicted of homicide. Jerry Wexler, who helped make Aretha Franklin famous. And many, many other great record producers who were Jews and working behind the scenes. They just knew what popular America wanted, just like the Louis B. Mayers and the Harry Cohns of Columbia Pictures. These guys just had an innate sense of what America wanted. And the money people behind the scenes were willing to put their money where their beliefs were to start these record companies and put these incredible talents front and center so that America would fall in love with them. So the Jewish presence and prominence in rock and roll makes total sense, both in terms of the marginalized outsider coming to the inside, as well as those who would have wanted to own land and farm land, but instead were pushed into commerce and finance and money careers, that they would have, their descendants would have been the ones to help generate the rock and roll industry in America. Is that clear to everybody? Okay, Paul, back to you. You're on mute, I think, right now, Paul.
As I said before, some people consider that a plus when I'm on mute. As Rabbi said, and to underscore the point that I made, what I'll say the African-American / Jewish connection in the 50s with respect to rock and roll was really strong, and that continued into the 60s. But now I'll talk to you about a few 60s artists. As Rabbi also said, and I think you all realize this, we could go on for hours and days. You could fall down the proverbial rabbit hole if you start to think about Jews and music, Jews and rock, and never mind Jews and entertainment. So consider this your big 40,000-foot view, and even with that, there's a lot to say. It's the 60s, and think about Jews as storytellers, tellers of essential truths. So here's a songwriting team. And again, the amount of songs from just this one team will floor you. Goffin and King. That's Carole King. Well, Carole King started music early. She began piano lessons at actually age 4, and she formed her first band in high school. And while attending at Queens College, she attended rock shows hosted by Alan Freed. You see how it all comes together. She became friends with people like Paul Simon, Neil Sedaka, and Jerry Goffin. And she later married this Jerry Goffin, and they became a songwriting team working out of the famous Brill Building on Broadway. I'm sure you've all heard of it. Beginning with the 1960 record, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, recorded by the Shirelles, which I think Rabbi mentioned. This duo wrote over 100 hit songs performed by artists ranging from the Beatles to Aretha Franklin. I'll just rattle off some of their songs. The Locomotion by Little Eva, 1962, and much later in 1974 by Grand Funk Railroad, a band that my dad didn't like because, quote, talentless kids shouldn't be making so much money. He said that on the Merritt Parkway in Stratford in 1974 when my brother wanted to hear the song The Locomotion on the radio by Grand Funk. Still remember that. What other songs did Goffin King do? Up on the Roof, The Drifters, produced by Lieber and Stoller. It All Comes Together. One Fine Day, The Chiffons, 1963. I'm Into Something Good, Herman's Hermits, 1964. Don't Bring Me Down, The Animals, 1966. Pleasant Valley Sunday, you may have heard that song. The Monkees, 1967. Natural Woman, Aretha Franklin, 1967. This is the best quote that I can find.
Wait, but don't forget Chains by the Beatles, that covered by the Beatles on Please Please Me. It's not they throw the Beatles in there.
Yeah, I'm trying to stay off them. I think
Goffin and King wrote that.
Yeah. Well, that ties into what I was going to say. In 1963, Lennon was quoted as saying that he wanted him and Paul to become the Goffin and King of England. So think about that. Lennon and McCartney wanted to be the Goffin and King of England because they wanted to be songwriters and they wanted to have hits on the radio. And I think they wanted to also make income in royalties from the songs being performed by others. So think about that. In 1963, John Lennon isn't saying, I want to be John Lennon. He's saying, I want to be those Americans, Goffin and King. Here's another songwriting team. Storytellers, Jews, Man and Weil. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. Songs that these folks wrote or worked on. Songs by the Crystals, He's Sure the Boy I Love in Uptown. More famously, We've Got to Get Out of This Place by the Animals. Shades of Grey by the Monkees. Yes, the Monkees. Hungry and Kicks for Paul Revere and the Raiders. Great rock songs. You're My Soul and Inspiration. And with Phil Spector, You've Lost That Lovin' Feeling for the Righteous Brothers. Make Your Own Kind of Music by Ellen Naomi Cohen. By the way, does anyone know who Ellen Naomi Cohen was? Mama Cass. Because Mama Cass sounded better for marketing purposes in the 1960s. Even though it's not the 1960s, I want to throw out two other Man and Weil songs. Here You Come Again. That's Dolly Parton. And maybe my favorite song of theirs, my favorite song of theirs actually was sung by two Jewish mice. Want to get their names right. Fievel and Tanya Mauskowitz, Somewhere Out There, which you all know. Somewhere Out There. Man and Weil. Again, songwriting teams that wrote lots of songs for lots of people that people still hear in their heads today, which is why there's no need to play these songs. We mentioned Neil Sedaka. Well, while training at Juilliard, yes, Neil went to Juilliard. He had his first songwriting hit with his longtime collaborator, Howard Greenfield. No surprise there. With a song called Stupid Cupid. He ended up in the Brill Building, the songwriting factory, and he worked alongside King and Goffin. Now, he had his own hits. You know some of these hits. Oh, Carol, Calendar Girl, Breaking Up Is Hard to Do. And interestingly, my favorite Neil Sedaka song is not very well known, but it's an insane earworm from 1975 called Bad Blood, which he performed with a uncredited but very obvious sounding Elton John. It was a big hit at the time for a guy who everyone thought career had petered out in the 1960s. But Neil Sedaka, who is still alive and was performing concerts even during lockdown. Here's an interesting but sad story. Phil Spector that Rabbi mentioned. Well, Phil entered the business in 1958. He was the songwriter, the lead guitarist, and background vocalist for the Jewish band the Teddy Bears that had one not very well-known song called To Know Him Is to Love Him. When that band fell apart, he went to New York, went to the Brill Building. He became a very successful songwriter and producer. He turned out hit albums for the Ronettes, the Crystals, and other all-girl groups. He worked with Lieber and Stoller, and he became very famous for his wall of sound technique. Remember, everyone was thinking in mono back in those days, and he tried to make songs that almost sounded like Wagner, the composer, with strings and horns and doubled instruments and background vocals. It became his signature sound, and it became widely copied. By the mid-1960s, he was producing bands like the Righteous Brothers and Ike and Tina Turner, but he grew frustrated by declining record sales in the United States, and he kind of retired in 1966. He came back in 1970 to produce albums by the Beatles, Let It Be, solo albums by John Lennon, Imagine, George Harrison. I think he produced the concert for Bangladesh. His some other songs, just to pick out songs that you know him, that you will recognize: Spanish Harlem, which was a collaboration with Lieber and Stoller and performed by Benny King. Be My Baby, which is Brian Wilson's favorite song by the Ronettes. What else? You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', the Righteous Brothers, and River Deep, Mountain High by Ike and Tina Turner. Actually, only Tina was on it. Ike was not. The song did not do well. It only made it to like number 88 in the charts in 1966. He thought it was going to be number 1. It did not do well in the States. He actually left the music business and really didn't come back until he was asked to produce Let It Be. We know what happened to him in later life. Rabbi discussed that. But I think maybe the best quote about Phil Spector comes from Little Steven of the E Street Band, which features Jewish drummer Max Weinberg. Little Steven said, Phil Spector was the ultimate example of the art always being better than the artist. And that's, of course, an eternal discussion. Can you separate the art from the artist? I'd like to think you can. And that's why I mentioned Phil Spector, despite what happened to him. 2 more songwriters, well, or actually 3, depending on how you count. We can't forget Simon and Garfunkel. Their career began in 1957 when they recorded something called Hey Schoolgirl. Yes, they called themselves Tom and Jerry. I guess they liked the cat and mouse. Art went to college because he was interested in being a math teacher. Paul continued his music career, didn't do too well. In 1964, they got back together. They recorded an album called Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. on Columbia Records. It didn't do well because it was folk, and it was 1964. When someone had the brilliant idea to remix The Sound of Silence with rock instruments, it became a hit. Because originally, as recorded, it did not have any bass or drums or any electric guitars. But when it got oomphed up or rocked up, Simon and Garfunkel became household names. But it basically took someone remixing a folk track, adding rock instrumentation for them to become popular. But it was 1965, so I can understand that. There's one more Jewish singer-songwriter who started in the early 60s and who's still going strong today, interestingly enough. That's Bob Zimmerman. Bobby Zimmerman. You know him as Bob Dylan. He graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1959 or thereabouts. He became a folk singer, came to New York in 1961. He got the attention of Columbia Records, came out with his first record of covers. It didn't do too well. His second record, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, that had originals, and that's when his legend was born. Acts like Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez covered his songs. He became famous. He then turned to rock with Like a Rolling Stone. And as some of you may know, when he turned to rock, a lot of people didn't like it. There's the famous recording of him and his band, which later became The Band, playing a concert in England in 1966. And when he took out his rock instruments, somebody yelled at him, "Judas," to which Bob Dylan famously replied, "You're lying." It's funny, he is never really, well, except for a little intermission in 67 and 68 and 69, he continues to perform to this day. His voice has deteriorated, to be kind, but he's still out there performing and recording. He turned to Christianity in the 1970s, recorded at least 3 Christian-based albums, but I think he's come back to Judaism. An example of someone who many people admire his lyrics, perhaps less so his music, but this is somebody who's been in the music business since 1961 and is still going fairly strong. He calls his tour the never-ending tour because he's been touring straight for decades, still going strong. I think he's in his early 80s at this point. And again, the folks I just mentioned with respect to the 60s, the one strain that they all have is they were out to tell stories, both verbally and, even in the case of Phil Spector, musically. They worked in the rock and pop and folk domains. But again, it's all about the storytelling. Oral, with an A, storytelling, words and music. That's what the focus was on. And given that they were all Jews, I'm not surprised at that. Rabbi, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was great, and I'm sure, Paul, as you mentioned, you really kind of touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to, there's so many other. You picked some great ones, but we can also come up with so many others. Neil Diamond and Leonard Cohen, and from those years. Just a few that come to mind, but and then of course, Paul, there was Helen Shapiro. But anyway, so
yeah, like I'll say it again. It's the problem with this is that we're, as the Brits say, we're spoiled for choice. So I just decided to do basically attack, if you will, maybe 5 from each era, because and that's the cool thing about it. Once you start,
there's no end. Yeah, and there's some who nobody knew were Jewish, like Frankie Vaughan from England. He was Jewish, but nobody knew it. Okay. Let's open it up to questions and comments. What do you think, guys? I really enjoyed listening to Paul's stories. I learned something. I knew some of the things that Paul was talking about, but I learned a lot tonight from Paul as well. So don't be shy. Come on, jump in. Ask a question or make a comment.
Well, I thought it was great. And I just want to ask Paul Friend, are you ever going to bring your rock and roll band to come to Friend Hall to do a little music for us?
That's possible.
I think that would be pretty cool if you could bring them to Friend Hall and your mom could come, and it'd be a lot of fun.
What a program that would be.
Yeah. You have to ask Kelly if she'd be willing to come. Kelly, we're putting you on the spot. Anyway, because Kelly's.
We're available for weddings, bar mitzvahs, funerals.
Funerals. Okay, well, let's not talk about funerals.
Yeah.
I write a lot of really depressing music.
Yeah,
we need
Kelly, Paul will tell you later the significance of Friend Hall.
Oh, I've heard all about Friend Hall, and he offered to sell me a square.
Oh, with a little musical note in it. Nice.
Yeah, I declined.
Okay, comments, questions, thoughts, or even if you want to talk about other Jews in rock and roll from the 50s and 60s that you loved that we haven't mentioned tonight.
What about Leslie Gore?
It's my party and I'll cry if I want to. Yeah, Leslie Gore. Nice Jewish girl from Long Island.
Yeah. Some of us resemble that remark.
Wait, and then there's the favorite song she did that I love was da, 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 da,
You Don't Own Me, which was,
no, I like, that was a great theme, that song. You Don't Own Me. That was like a feminist song.
yeah, in the early 60s.
And then there was another one, something like, Baby, I know that you've been a cheat. Da, da, da. Paul, do you know who wrote that?
No.
Great song. Okay, Leslie Gore. Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, and it's but it's interesting that I'll the next time we meet, I'll even go into this further. It's unfortunate that, but we as Jews can all appreciate this, that so many of our Jewish colleagues, and this is like going in a totally different direction, had to basically smooth out their identity. We talked before, Irving Berlin was not born Irving Berlin. Bob Dylan was not born Bob Dylan. And I think we all know what I'm talking about, that, as a kid, I shouldn't speak for everybody, but I didn't necessarily think, oh, these songs were written by Jews. It was more, these are interesting songs. So it's interesting how the Jewish identity, I suppose, to reach mainstream success, had to be, again, I'm trying to choose my words carefully, suppressed a little bit.
Yes.
We've all read stories about, you can find it online, the original name was, Shlomo whatever. Sam turns into Sam Smith. But it's interesting how, despite there's a strong Jewish thumbprint with respect to rock and pop and other forms of culture, how as a kid growing up, I didn't necessarily, I'll put it this way, and we'll get to this, 2 weeks. I didn't know that the members of KISS were mainly Jewish, and they weren't broadcasting that either. That's a whole other story that we'll get to next time.
One
Jewishness was suppressed. Go ahead.
One notable exception to what you just said, I would say, was the Loving Spoonful. Zal Yanofsky,
Yep.
who was their guitarist and never changed his name.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Jewish, obviously.
We have a question with the Mermelsteins, and then I have a comment too.
Yeah, Paul, you kept talking about overproduced.
Phil Spector.
Yeah, Phil Spector overproducing the Beatles. And I know you love the Beatles, and I wasn't sure what you were criticizing or what you're referring to.
Oh, okay. Some of you may have seen the recent Beatles movie, the 9-hour marathon, Get Back, on Disney Plus, which is actually, it was supposed to be released on DVD this week, but apparently when there were major audio problems with the DVD, so Disney has pulled the DVD and it was supposed to come out next month. Anyway, so Get Back was supposed to be live stuff, quickly pulled together. But the long story short is this: Get Back, the original tape sounded really raw because the Beatles created these songs and recorded these songs really quickly, all within the month of January 1969. So, hang on. Yes, my virus detector decided to go off. Anyway, Beatles recorded the Get Back, Let It Be songs very quickly, and they didn't sound that good. Phil Spector was basically called in to make the songs sound better. So he added stuff to make it sound better. But what did he add? He added violins. He added female background voices, which you never heard in a Beatles song. He added horns. One of my favorite reviews described the traffic jam horns that appear in Let It Be, the song. He was trying to make it sound better and make it more commercial. And that's what John Lennon said. I can't tell you exactly what John said because it's kind of foul. But basically, John said, Phil took the most badly recorded set of censored ever and made it sound good. Well, that's what John Lennon said. However, Paul McCartney did not like what Phil did. And in fact, there's a famous letter that Paul wrote that said, with regard to what you did to Let It I'm sorry, with regard to what you did, Phil, to the long and winding road without my permission, adding on strings, adding on background female vocals, with regard to what you did, don't ever do it again. And had a couple of foul words about that. Now, the version that came out had the Phil Spector editions. So the joke in Beatles world is that Let It Be, produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector in an effort to make it sound better. But that was Phil's style, to embellish it, to make these songs monumental, almost orchestral. Again, strings, horns, background vocals, doubling. Why have one guitar, he told George Harrison, when you could have 5? Another album that Phil kind of ruined, to George Harrison's lasting regret, All Things Must Pass, from 1970, George's first album, a triple album. Great songs, but overproduced. And George always thought, maybe going back and taking stuff away, but you couldn't do it. So, great. Half the songs are superb, to say the least, on All Things Must Pass. But because it's overproduced, in 2022, it's hard to listen to. Ruth, in a word, with Phil, there's always too much going on. Phil Spector thought it was ear-catching. It didn't. What his work did not age well, especially with the Beatles. Overproduced by Phil Spector. That's my answer on that. Maybe more than you wanted to know, but there you have it.
So I just wanted to say that I was glad you made the comment before Ruth asked her question about not really knowing who was Jewish, thinking about who was Jewish when we grew up, because I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and that thought just never even entered our minds. Certainly didn't enter my mind. I heard the music. I didn't associate a name with the music. The music sounded good. I enjoyed listening to it, but never made a connection. I mean, that was like the farthest thing from our minds. And oh, by the way, when I was going to say earlier, and you got ahead of me, the Fairfield Beach Club, I have to tell you, I remember that vividly, not to mention Brooklawn Country Club. So it was a totally different world we were living in then.
Oh, that's right. Carol, I remember hearing at John Zucker's house, Dr. Zucker, Jonas Pearl Zucker. I remember hearing this band that John Zucker played for me in 1976, a punk band called the Ramones. And some of you know this story. I'll get to this in 2 weeks. I thought the Ramones, if you look at the album cover, I thought they were like 4 Puerto Rican guys from the Bronx. Some of them, including the lead singer, were Jewish. But they weren't marketed as that. I guess you didn't do that back then. A punk band, who knew? But Jews. And when you realize that about them, and then you hear the songs with that in mind, it sounds different. It almost makes more sense. They have when I first heard, anyway, I could go on and on. But again, once you find out what the context is, the music almost makes sense. It sounds different, but we'll get to that. But again, you're right. It wasn't advertised as, did you know some of these guys are Jewish? It just wasn't done. But the fact is they were. And that informed their music. And when you know about it, it makes it sound different. More in 2 weeks about that.
It's true.
Any other comments, questions? If not, I think, Carol, you can wrap it up.
I will. This was wonderful. It was informative. It certainly gave me something to think about, and I think it gave everybody else something to think about. It puts things into perspective. And I think that's not only interesting, but important, very important. So I hope you have February 22nd on your calendar because more to come. We've got the second part of this, and I do believe there will be a raffle drawing that night. I also want to invite everybody to hold the date of April 30th for our quasi reunion where Rabbi Stephen Leon and Rabbi David Nelson will be attending and being our, Stephen Leon will be our keynote speaker. We've got lots and lots of things going on at Rodeph Sholom, not to mention that tomorrow morning we have coffee and conversation, and it is a mystery. So if you want to know who the speaker is, you'll have to come along and see, and you won't be disappointed. So with that, I'm going to thank Paul Friend and Rabbi Eisenberg for again being our dynamic duo. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Rabbi. Awesome. Thank you.
Enjoy being with you, everybody.
And Paul, I will be in contact with you.
Okay.
We could use a little rock and roll in Friend Hall, don't you think?
Oh, yeah.
And we have just the opportunity, so
We have an idea, Carol.
I
and
was
We'll
thinking
talk
of
to
that. Yeah, Debbie, I was,
That's
great
dangerous.
minds work alike.
Okay.
All right,
Okay,
everybody.
I'm going to end this. Have a good evening. Stay
Good
safe.
night, everybody.
Thank you. Very
Bye.
good. Excellent.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night, everybody. Thank you,
You too,
Rabbi.
Edith. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.